The rope tightened around her neck as the angry crowd roared for blood. She was just a healer, a woman who saved lives with her bare hands. But in a village consumed by fear, healing had become her death sentence. Just as the executioner reached for the lever, hoofbeats thundered through the square. A mysterious gunfighter burst through the crowd, his voice cutting through the chaos. "She's innocent, this woman saved my life." But will his word be enough to stop a mob that's already tasted justice? And what dark secrets from the past are about to be revealed? Hit that like button if you're ready for an emotional journey, subscribe for more incredible stories, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Now, let's dive into this tale of courage, healing, and unexpected salvation. The rope felt coarse against Miriam's palms as they bound her wrists behind the wooden post. Each fiber seemed to whisper accusations. Witch, sorceress, bringer of death. The crowd gathered like storm clouds, their faces twisted with fear and certainty. She could taste the salt of her own tears, but underneath lay something else, the bitter knowledge that their fear stemmed not from evil, but from healing they couldn't understand. The morning sun cast long shadows across the village square, and Miriam found herself studying the way light fractured through the autumn leaves overhead. Even now, facing death, her healer's mind catalogued details. The way Mrs. Henderson's arthritic hands trembled as she pointed, the fever-bright gleam in young Timothy's eyes, the collective breath held too tight in 40 pairs of lungs. Murderer. Someone called from the back. The word hit her chest like a physical blow. She had never taken a life, only tried to save them. Her fingertips still remembered the texture of Thomas Hartwell's skin when the fever finally broke. How his breathing had steadied under her touch. That had been 3 days before he died, 3 days when his family had hope again. Father Mackenzie stepped forward, his black robes billowing in the crisp October wind. "Miriam Walsh," he intoned, "you stand accused of practicing dark arts that resulted in the death of Thomas Hartwell." She closed her eyes and let herself remember Thomas as he truly was. Not the corpse they found in his fields, but the man who had smiled when she'd brought him fever-few tea, who had pressed a copper coin into her palm even when she'd refused payment. The crowd's murmur rose and fell like ocean waves, and Miriam felt herself drowning in their collective judgment. Somewhere in that sea of faces was her sister Mary, forbidden by her husband to speak in Miriam's defense. Their eyes met for one burning moment before Mary looked away, and Miriam tasted the full bitterness of abandonment. "Do you have any final words?" Father Mackenzie asked. Miriam opened her mouth, then closed it. What words could bridge the chasm between their fear and her truth? Instead, she lifted her chin and gazed beyond the crowd, beyond the village, to where the mountains held the sky like a promise she couldn't name. 5 years earlier. The stranger had arrived during the worst storm anyone could remember, collapsed on her doorstep with blood seeping through his clothes like spilled wine. Miriam had found him at dawn, his face grey as ash, his breathing shallow as a bird's. No one came to her cottage during storms. No one came to her cottage at all, unless desperation drove them beyond the village's comfortable prejudices. She lived at the edge of everything, the forest, the town, acceptance itself. She had dragged him inside, her bare feet sliding on the wet wooden floor. His clothes were expensive but ruined, his hands soft despite the calluses along his trigger finger. A gunslinger, then, the kind of man the village would have turned away without hesitation. But dying men had no allegiances, and Miriam's hands knew only healing. For 3 days and nights, she had worked over him with the single-minded intensity of someone fighting death itself. She'd cleaned his wounds with water boiled with comfrey root, stitched his flesh with thread thin as spider silk, fed him broth drop by precious drop when consciousness flickered behind his closed lids. On the 4th day, his fever broke. When his eyes finally opened, blue as winter sky, she had been grinding willow bark, and the pestle had slipped from her suddenly trembling hands. "You stayed," he had whispered, his voice rough as sand. She had nodded, unable to speak. In 3 days, no one from the village had come to check on her. No one had asked if she needed help with the stranger. She might have died alongside him, and they would have found 2 corpses when spring came. He had tried to sit up, winced, settled back against her pillow. "What's your name?" "Miriam." "I'm James." He had paused, studying her face with those startling blue eyes. "You saved my life." She had turned away then, busying herself with tidying supplies that didn't need tidying. People said those words sometimes, but they never meant them the way this stranger did, as if her actions had weight, as if they mattered beyond the moment. When he left a week later, he had pressed something into her palm, a silver pendant no larger than a coin, etched with intricate patterns that seemed to shift in the lamplight. "A protection charm," he had said, "from someone who knows its value." She had kept it ever since, worn against her skin like a secret. Father Mackenzie's voice cut through her reverie, like the blade of an executioner's axe. "By the authority vested in me by God and the territorial government, I sentence you to hang by the neck until dead." The crowd surged forward, hungry for the culmination of their righteousness. Miriam felt the rough wood of the gallows against her spine as they pushed her toward the steps. Each plank groaned under the weight of accumulated hatred, fear transformed into justified violence. She thought of the pendant hidden beneath her bodice, warm against her racing heart. James, wherever he was now, would he remember the woman who had pulled him back from death's threshold? Would he think of her when news of her hanging reached whatever distant place harbored him? The rope scratched against her throat as the executioner adjusted the noose. Somewhere in the crowd, a child began to cry, long keening sobs that cut through the adult's grim satisfaction. Miriam closed her eyes and tried to remember every plant she had ever gathered, every tincture she had ever brewed, every hand she had ever healed. This was how it ended then, not with gratitude for the lives she had saved, but with condemnation for the one she couldn't. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward from the crowd, her face flushed with righteous anger. "She cursed my chickens. They stopped laying after she walked past my fence." "And my well went dry," shouted another voice, 2 days after she asked for water. Miriam wanted to laugh at the absurdity, as if she controlled the weather, the UI, seasons, the very earth itself, as if healing and hexing were the same desperate dance with forces beyond human understanding. The hangman placed his hand on the lever that would drop the platform beneath her feet. Father Mackenzie opened his prayer book, preparing to commend her soul to whatever judgment awaited. The crowd fell silent, breath held in collective anticipation. In that hushed moment before death, Miriam heard something else, the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats, growing louder with each passing second. The horseman burst through the crowd like lightning splitting darkness. People scattered as his black stallion reared, hooves pouring the air above their heads. The rider's coat billowed behind him like wings, and for one impossible moment, Miriam thought she was seeing death itself come to claim her personally. Then he spoke, and her heart nearly stopped. "She's innocent," the voice carried across, the square with the authority of a man accustomed to being heard. James, older now, weathered by years and miles, but unmistakably the same blue eyes that had opened in her cottage 5 years ago. The crowd recoiled, uncertain how to process this interruption of their justice. Father Mackenzie raised his hand. For silence. But James was already dismounting, his boots striking the wooden platform with deliberate precision. "This woman saved my life," James announced, his voice cutting through the murmur of confused voices. "She's no witch, she's a healer." Miriam's knees nearly buckled with relief and disbelief. He had come against all odds. Across whatever distances separated them, he had come. "And who are you to interrupt God's justice?" Father Mackenzie demanded, his face flushed with indignation. James stepped closer to the noose, his hand moving to rest on the gun at his hip, not as a threat, but as a reminder of what he was. James Morrison. Some of you might have heard the name. Several. People in the crowd stepped backward. Even Miriam had heard stories of James Morrison, the gunfighter who never missed, whose reputation extended far beyond their small territory. But reputation was one thing. Standing 3 feet away from him was another entirely. "This doesn't concern you, Morrison," called out Mr. Henderson, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. James turned toward the crowd, and Miriam saw something in his face that made her breath catch. a raw vulnerability beneath the dangerous exterior. "It concerns me more than you know." He looked up at her then, their eyes meeting across the years and circumstances that had brought them to this moment. In his gaze she saw recognition, gratitude, and something else that made her pulse quicken despite the noose around her throat. "Tell them," he said quietly, meant only for her. "Tell them what you did for me." But Miriam found her voice had abandoned her entirely. The crowd pressed closer, hungry for explanation, while Father Mackenzie's face darkened with frustration at this unexpected complication to his carefully orchestrated execution. James moved with deliberate care as he reached up to loosen the noose around Miriam's throat. His fingers were steady despite the crowd's restless energy, and she felt their warmth through the coarse rope. When their skin touched, just for an instant, she drew her first real breath in hours. "5 years ago," James began, his voice carrying easily across the square, "I was dying in a ditch 3 miles outside your village, shot, fevered, left for dead by men who thought they knew justice too." The crowd shifted, uncertain. Mrs. Patterson clutched her shawl tighter. "That don't mean nothing. Could be anyone, could be," James agreed, never taking his eyes off Miriam's face. "But it wasn't. It was this woman who found me. This woman who spent 3 days keeping death at bay while everyone else crossed the street to avoid helping. A stranger." Miriam felt heat rise in her cheeks. She remembered those 3 days differently, not as heroism but as necessity. A dying man required healing. The equation had been that simple. Father Mackenzie's voice cut through the moment like a blade. "Even if that's true, it changes nothing. Thomas Hartwell is dead, and she was the last to treat him." Thomas Hartwell was dying anyway. Miriam finally found her voice rough from the rope's pressure. "I couldn't save him. I tried, but sometimes trying isn't enough," James finished quietly. He turned to address the crowd, but his words seemed meant for her alone. "Sometimes you lose the battle, despite fighting with everything you have. That doesn't make you a murderer." The crowd murmured, torn between their desire for simple answers and the growing complexity of the situation. Miriam could see doubt creeping into some faces, fear hardening others. Mrs. Henderson stepped forward, her arthritic hands clenched into fists. "She's different, always has been. Lives alone, talks to plants, refuses to come to church." "Being different isn't a crime," James said, his hand still resting near his gun. "Last I checked, healing people wasn't either. But the crops someone called out of the wells, the chickens," James held up his hand, and the voices died away. "Coincidence and superstition. You want someone to blame for Thomas's death because blaming sickness and bad luck is harder than blaming a woman who lives at the edge of your acceptance." Miriam watched him stand between her and the crowd's anger, this man who owed her nothing beyond a debt 5 years old. Something tight and afraid in her chest began to loosen, replaced by a warmth she didn't quite dare name. Father Mackenzie's face had taken on the mottled red of a man accustomed to absolute authority, finding it suddenly questioned. He gripped his prayer book with white knuckles, the leather binding creaking under pressure. "Mr. Morrison," he said, investing the name with all the disdain he could muster, "while your reputation precedes you, this is a matter of spiritual jurisdiction. This woman has been tried and found guilty." "By whose authority?" James interrupted. "I don't see a judge here. I don't see a jury. I see a mob with a rope." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Several villagers shifted uncomfortably, perhaps remembering that justice required more than community outrage, but others pushed forward, unwilling to abandon their righteous certainty. "She killed Thomas!" Mrs. Hartwell's voice cracked across the square. "Thomas's widow," Miriam realized with a stab of sympathy. Grief could make anyone desperate for someone to blame. "No," Miriam said softly, finding strength in James's presence behind her. "I tried to save him. I gave him everything I knew. Feverfew for the sweats, willow bark for pain, prayers for what medicine couldn't touch. Prayers to what?" Father Mackenzie seized on the word like a weapon. To God or to darker powers? Miriam felt the pendant warm against her skin, James's gift, carrying its own kind of protection, To whatever force moves through healing hands and growing things. Call it God if you need a name for it. The crowd rippled with unease. This was too complex for their simple narrative of good and evil, witch and victim. James stepped closer to the platform, his voice dropping so only she could hear. Tell them about the others, the ones you did save. But Miriam shook her head slightly. Those people, the ones whose fevers she'd broken, whose wounds she'd cleaned, whose pain she'd eased, they stood silent in the crowd now, afraid to speak in her defense. Speaking would mean admitting they had sought help from someone the community, now labeled evil. Young Timothy Collins caught her eye for a moment, the boy whose broken arm she'd set 2 summers ago. His mother's hand clamped down on his shoulder when he opened his mouth, pulling him back into the safety of anonymity. This was the cruelest cut of all, not that they wanted her dead, but that they would let her die to preserve their own standing in a community built on fear of anything different. James seemed to sense her thoughts. Sometimes, he said quietly, courage has to be a solitary act. Mrs. Patterson pushed through the crowd, her face flushed with the particular righteousness of someone about to reveal a long-held secret. I seen her, in the woods, gathering God knows what under the full moon, talking to herself like someone who knows plants grow different at different times, Miriam interrupted, her voice steadying. Moonwort and evening primrose are stronger when harvested at night. It's not magic, it's knowledge. Knowledge passed down from who? Father Mackenzie demanded. Your grandmother was strange too. God rest her damned soul. These things run in families, this connection to dark things. Miriam's throat tightened. Her grandmother had been the village healer before her, dying when Miriam was 16 and leaving behind only her journals and a reputation the girl had inherited along with her cottage. But what Father Mackenzie called darkness, her grandmother had called light. The ancient wisdom of women who understood that healing required partnership with forces older than churches and newer than fear. James moved closer to the platform's edge. Strange how this dark knowledge somehow manages to heal people. Seems like darkness would do the opposite. The devil can heal too, Father Mackenzie shot back, to better tempt the faithful. Then, maybe, James said with dangerous quiet, you should be questioning why God lets the devil do a better job than his appointed servants. The words hit the square like a physical blow. Several villagers made the sign of the cross, while others murmured prayers or curses. Father Mackenzie's face went white, then red, then white again. But it was Mrs. Hartwell who broke the tense silence, her voice raw with grief. I don't care who heals or who kills. My Thomas is dead, and someone needs to pay. Miriam's heart ached for the woman's pain. Mrs. Hartwell, she said gently, I know you're hurting. I know you need this to make sense. But Thomas was sick long before he came to me. His lungs were already— Lies! Mrs. Hartwell screamed. He was fine until you touched him with your cursed hands. He was dying, Miriam said simply. I couldn't save him. I'm not God. The admission hung in the air like a challenge. This was what they couldn't forgive. Not that she had failed to save Thomas, but that she had tried at all, that she had dared to reach for power beyond their understanding, even in service of healing. James reached into his coat and withdrew something small and silver. Miriam's pendant. Somehow he had kept one just like it. This charm, he said, holding it up to catch the light, was blessed by a Lakota medicine woman. She gave it to me, because I respected her knowledge instead of fearing it. He looked directly at Father Mackenzie. Sometimes wisdom comes from unexpected places. The crowd's energy had shifted from bloodthirsty certainty to uneasy confusion. Miriam could feel their collective mood wavering like a candle flame in wind, still dangerous, but no longer inevitable. James climbed onto the platform beside her, moving with the fluid grace she remembered from his convalescence. Up close she could see the lines that years and weather had etched around his eyes, the silver threading through his dark hair. But his hands were steady as ever when he reached for the ropes binding her wrists. May I? He asked quietly, and something in his formal courtesy made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. She nodded, not trusting her voice. His fingers worked at the knots with practiced efficiency, and she felt the blood flow returning to her hands in painful prickles. When the ropes fell away, she flexed her fingers, reacquainting herself with freedom. "Thank you," she whispered. Their eyes met, and for a moment the crowd fell away entirely. She saw recognition there, but also something deeper, a understanding, born of shared experience with isolation, with being judged for things beyond their control. James reached up and carefully lifted the noose over her head, his knuckles brushing her throat as he did. The touch was gentle, reverent almost, and Miriam realized he was handling her as carefully as she had once handled his wounds. "There," he said softly. "That's better." Father Mackenzie's voice cut through the moment like an axe through silk. "This interruption changes nothing. The woman was condemned by proper process." "What process?" A new voice demanded from the crowd. Dr. Samuel Morton pushed through the pressed bodies, his medical bag in hand, and his grey hair dishevelled as if he'd been summoned hastily. "I heard the commotion from my office. What's this about an execution?" Miriam's heart sank. Dr. Morton represented the modern world of medicine, trained in universities and licensed by territorial authorities. He had always viewed her healing work with professional disdain, considering her methods primitive superstition at best. "Doctor," Father Mackenzie said with obvious relief, "perhaps you can explain to these people the difference between proper medical treatment and whatever it is this woman practices." But Dr. Morton's response surprised everyone. "I can explain that Thomas Hartwell came to see me 2 weeks before he died," he said slowly. "His lungs were already compromised, advanced consumption, probably months in the making." The crowd stirred uneasily. Mrs. Hartwell stepped forward, her face confused. "But you didn't say, you never told me." "Because," Dr. Morton said gently, "there was nothing I could do for him. Nothing anyone could do. By the time symptoms appeared, it was already too late." The revelation hit the crowd like a stone, thrown into still water, sending ripples of confusion and doubt in all directions. Miriam felt her knees go weak with relief, and James's hand appeared at her elbow, steadying her without drawing attention to the gesture. "Consumption." Mrs. Hartwell's voice was barely a whisper. "But he seemed fine. He was working the fields just—" "Consumption is like that," Dr. Morton said kindly. "It hides until it can't anymore. By the time Thomas started coughing blood, his lungs were already beyond help." Father Mackenzie's face had gone pale. "Why didn't you speak up before?" "Because I wasn't here," Dr. Morton replied. "I was called to Millbrook for an emergency surgery. I only returned an hour ago to find half the town talking about hanging a woman for practicing medicine." The words hung in the air like an indictment. Several villagers began to look ashamed, while others clung stubbornly to their anger. "Mrs. Patterson pushed forward again, her voice shrill with desperation. "But she's still a witch. Look at her, living alone, never married, communing with plants like they were people." "I commune with plants," Dr. Morton said dryly, "every time. I prepare a digitalis tincture for heart ailments or a willow bark extract for pain. The only difference is where I learned to do it." Miriam found her voice at last. "I learned from my grandmother, who learned from hers. The knowledge goes back generations, women helping women birth babies and heal sickness when doctors were scarce or couldn't be afforded." She looked out at the crowd, seeing familiar faces twisted by fear and uncertainty. "I've set broken bones for your children, eased labor pains for your wives, brought down fevers that might have killed your husbands." When did healing become evil? "When it failed," someone called out, but the voice lacked conviction. James stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. "Every doctor fails sometimes. Every healer loses patience. If we hanged people for not being able to conquer death itself, there wouldn't be enough rope in the territory." Mrs. Hartwell sank to her knees in the dirt, her sobs echoing across the square. The sound was heartbreaking. Not just grief for her husband, but the terrible realization that her need for someone to blame had nearly led to murder. Miriam descended from the platform slowly, her legs still unsteady. Without thinking, she moved toward the grieving woman, her healer's instincts stronger than self-preservation. "Don't," several voices warned, but she kept walking until she could kneel beside Mrs. Hartwell in the dust. "I'm sorry," Miriam said simply. "I'm sorry. I couldn't save him. I'm sorry you're in pain. I'm sorry we almost let our fear turn us all into something we're not. Mrs. Hartwell looked up, her eyes red with tears. I needed someone to blame. The hurt was too big for anything else. I know, Miriam said, and reached out to touch the woman's shoulder. I know. The crowd began to disperse slowly, people drifting away with the shamefaced awkwardness of those who had been caught in collective madness. Some offered mumbled apologies as they passed. Others simply avoided meeting Miriam's eyes. The crisis had passed, but its aftermath hung in the air like smoke from a recently extinguished fire. James remained on the platform, watching the square, empty with the wariness of a man accustomed to trouble. Only when the last villager had disappeared around the corner did he climb down to where Miriam still knelt beside Mrs. Hartwell. "Come on, Anna," he said gently to the widow. "Let's get you home." He helped both women to their feet with careful courtesy, and Miriam found herself studying his face as he spoke quietly to Mrs. Hartwell. This was a different side of the gunfighter, tender, patient, unafraid of tears or grief. After Mrs. Hartwell's son arrived to escort her home, Miriam and James stood alone in the empty square. The gallows loomed behind them like an accusation, but somehow its power had been broken. It was just wood and rope now, not an instrument of community judgment. "You didn't have to come," Miriam said finally, breaking the silence that stretched between them. "Yes, I did." James picked up his hat from where it had fallen during the confrontation, brushing dust from its brim. "I owed you a debt." 5 years is a long time to carry a debt. He looked at her then, really looked, taking in the changes that time had wrought. She was thinner than he remembered, her face more angular, her hair showing the first threads of silver at the temples. But her hands were the same, long-fingered and gentle, marked by countless hours of grinding herbs and tending wounds. "Some debts don't diminish with time," he said quietly. They began walking toward her cottage at the edge of town, their footsteps echoing in the aftermath silence. Miriam felt the strangeness of having someone beside her on this familiar path. She had walked it alone for so many years that companionship felt foreign, precious, and slightly dangerous all at once. "Where will you go now?" she asked, assuming his appearance in her life would be as brief as his first departure. James was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his words surprised her. "I was thinking of staying around for a while. This seems like a good place to rest." "Here." Miriam couldn't keep the astonishment from her voice. "After what you just witnessed?" "Especially after what I just witnessed." James stopped walking and turned to face her. A woman who risks her life to heal others, and a community that nearly lost its soul to fear. Both could use someone watching over them for a while. Miriam felt something flutter in her chest that she was afraid to name. "I don't need protection." "Maybe not," James agreed. "But maybe I need something to protect." That evening, Miriam sat at her kitchen table grinding chamomile by lamplight, trying to restore normalcy through familiar ritual. But her hands trembled slightly as she worked, and the events of the day replayed themselves in endless, exhausting loops. A soft knock at her door made her freeze. Few people came to her cottage even in the best of times, and after this morning's near execution, she had expected complete isolation. She opened the door to find James standing on her threshold, a cloth-wrapped bundle in his hands, and an expression of careful uncertainty on his face. "I brought dinner," he said. "Thought you might not feel like cooking tonight." The simple gesture nearly undid her. When was the last time someone had considered her comfort, her needs, her state of mind? She stepped aside to let him enter, noticing how he had to duck slightly to clear the doorframe. "You don't have to," she began, but he was already unwrapping the bundle to reveal bread, cheese, and what looked like stew from the boarding house kitchen. "I know I don't have to," he said mildly. "I wanted to." They ate in comfortable silence, the lamplight casting warm shadows across the small room. Miriam found herself studying James's hands as he broke bread, scarred and weathered, but moving with surprising delicacy. These were hands that had dealt death, but also hands that had helped Mrs. Hartwell to her feet with infinite gentleness. "The pendant," she said suddenly, remembering. "You said it was blessed by a Lakota medicine woman." James nodded, reaching into his vest to withdraw the silver charm identical to hers. Her name was Ayana. She taught me that healing and harming often spring from the same source. The difference lies in intention. And what was your intention today? To prevent a good woman from dying for other people's fears. He set the pendant on the table. Between them, its etched surface catching the light. Same as yours has always been. To help when helping is needed. Miriam reached for her own pendant, still warm from resting against her skin all day. I've worn this every day since you gave it to me. I told myself it was just a reminder. Of what? She met his eyes across the small table, seeing patience there and acceptance, and something that made her pulse quicken. That someone once saw my healing as a gift instead of a curse. James reached across the table, his fingertips barely brushing hers. More than once, he said quietly, and more than someone. The touch was gentle, questioning, offering without demanding. Miriam felt tears prick her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief of being seen, truly seen, by someone who understood the cost of being different. I don't know how to do this, she whispered. Do what? Trust that you won't leave again. James was quiet for a long moment, his fingers still touching hers. I can't promise I'll never leave, he said finally, but I can promise that if I do, it won't be because you're too much or too strange or too powerful for me to handle. Miriam woke before sunrise, as was her habit, but instead of rising immediately, she lay still in her narrow bed and listened to the unfamiliar sound of someone else breathing in her cottage. James had insisted on sleeping on the floor by the hearth, despite her protests that he could return to the boarding house. Too many people know where to find me there, he had said simply, and she had understood. His intervention in her execution had made him enemies as well as allies. She dressed quietly and slipped outside to tend her garden, needing the familiar ritual of checking plants and harvesting herbs to center herself after yesterday's chaos. The morning air was crisp with approaching winter, and dew sparkled on, the last hardy flowers like scattered diamonds. She was kneeling beside her feverfew patch when James appeared, moving so quietly she might not have noticed him, if not for his shadow falling across her work. You're up early, she said without looking up. Habit. He crouched beside her, studying the neat rows of medicinal plants with genuine interest. This is impressive. You've got everything organized by use and season. My grandmother's design. She believed gardens should be as practical as they are beautiful. Miriam sat back on her heels, wiping soil from her hands. She taught me that every plant has a purpose, even the ones that look like weeds. James reached out to touch a cluster of small white flowers. What's this one for? Yarrow. It stops bleeding, reduces fever, helps with women's troubles. She watched his careful touch, noting how he handled the delicate blooms. Most people walk right past it. Most people don't know how to look, James said. They see surface things. What's familiar? What's comfortable? What fits their expectations? He was talking about more than plants, Miriam realized. Is that why you became a gunfighter? Because people expected it? James was quiet for so long, she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with old pain. My father was a preacher, expected me to follow in his footsteps, spread the word of God to frontier towns. What happened? I started asking questions he didn't like. About why God's mercy seemed to depend so much on skin color and bank accounts. About why healing was called holy when he did it, but evil when someone like your grandmother did it. James's fingers stilled on the yarrow blossoms. When I wouldn't stop asking, he threw me out, said I was corrupted by dark influences. So you became exactly what he accused you of being, for a while. James looked at her then, his blue eyes holding depths she was only beginning to understand. Until I met someone who showed me that healing and harming don't have to be the same thing, that choosing to help instead of hurt is what makes us human. 3 weeks passed in a rhythm Miriam had never experienced. Days punctuated by shared meals, quiet conversations, and the simple pleasure of someone else's presence in her previously solitary world. James had rented a room above the blacksmith's shop but spent most of his time at her cottage, helping with repairs and harvest preparations that she had always managed alone. The village's attitude toward her remained complicated. Some people had begun to seek her help again, shame-faced and apologetic. Others crossed the street when they saw her coming, unable to face their own part in nearly murdering an innocent woman. But the death threats had stopped, and she no longer felt eyes watching her with murderous intent. It was Dr. Morton who brought the news that would change everything. "James," he said, arriving at the cottage one grey November morning with urgency written across his features. "There's a federal marshal in town asking questions about you." Miriam felt her blood turn cold. James, who had been chopping wood behind the cottage, set down his axe with deliberate care. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that suggests someone's posted a bounty on your head, a big one." Dr. Morton glanced nervously toward the village. "Word is, you killed a territorial judge's son in a fair fight, and the judge isn't interested in fairness when it comes to revenge." James nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this news. "How long do I have?" "Marshall's planning to ride out at first light tomorrow. He's got 3 deputies with him and orders to bring you back. Dead or alive?" Miriam's hands began to shake. She had known this moment would come, had known from the beginning that James's presence in her life was temporary, stolen time that would eventually be reclaimed by his dangerous past. "You have to leave," she said quietly. "Tonight." No." James looked at her with an expression that made her heart crack. "Come with me." The words hung in the air like a challenge to everything she had ever known. Leave her cottage, her garden, her life's work. For what? A fugitive existence. Always running, never safe? "I can't," she whispered. "This is my home. These people, they need someone who understands healing." "Even after what they almost did to you?" "Especially because of what they almost did." Miriam pressed her hands against her skirts to still their trembling. "Someone has to stay and remind them that fear doesn't have to win." James nodded slowly, understanding even as it broke something between them. "I know. I wouldn't ask if I didn't, if things were different, but they're not different." Miriam forced herself to meet his eyes. "And we both know it." Dr. Morton cleared his throat awkwardly. "I'll leave you two to say goodbye." After he left, they stood in the small cottage that had become their shared refuge, surrounded by the silence of things that couldn't be changed. James left before dawn, as quietly as he had arrived weeks ago, but this time Miriam was awake to watch him go. She stood at her window in the pre-dawn darkness, seeing his silhouette merge with shadows as he led his horse away from the cottage, and toward whatever future awaited a man with a price on his head. He had left something on her kitchen table, not just the pendant this time, but a leather pouch filled with seeds she didn't recognize. A note written in his careful script explained, "From Ayana's garden. She said they carry protection and new beginnings wherever they're planted. Plant them when you're ready for both." Miriam held the pouch against her chest and allowed herself one moment of grief for what couldn't be, before turning toward what was. The marshal and his deputies found nothing when they searched the village. James Morrison had vanished like morning mist, leaving behind only questions and a woman who claimed to know nothing about his whereabouts. Which was true in its way. She didn't know where he was going, only that he was gone. Spring came early that year. Miriam planted Ayana's seeds in a small plot beside her cottage, tending them with the same careful attention she gave all growing things. When they sprouted into plants she didn't recognize, flowers with silver-edged petals and leaves that seemed to shimmer in moonlight, she understood that some gifts transcend the physical world. The village had changed too. Mrs. Hartwell began, bringing her preserves and asking shy questions about herbs for sleeplessness. Dr. Morton started referring patients to her for conditions beyond his training. Even Father Mackenzie nodded politely when they passed on the street, though he never quite met her eyes. Young Timothy Collins came to her one evening with a cut on his hand that needed tending, bringing with it a stammered apology for his silence during her trial. "I wanted to speak up," he said as she cleaned the wound. "But my ma said—" "Your mother was afraid," Miriam said gently. "Fear makes people do things they regret later. The important thing is that you're here now." As she bandaged his hand, she felt the silver pendant warm against her skin. James's gift, carrying its blessing of protection and new beginnings. She thought of him somewhere on the vast frontier, perhaps helping other women who lived at the edges of acceptance, perhaps still fighting the same battles in different towns. But she was fighting them here, in the garden where strange flowers bloomed under starlight, in the cottage where healing happened one patient at a time, in the village that had almost lost its soul but found it again through the simple act of choosing trust over fear. The pendant's warmth reminded her that some connections transcend distance and time. Somewhere, James carried a matching silver charm and memories of a woman who had shown him that healing was possible. Here she carried the knowledge that love didn't always mean staying. Sometimes it meant giving someone the courage to become who they were meant to be. As autumn returned, Miriam harvested the seeds from Ayana's mysterious plants, carefully storing them for next year's planting. Each seed held the promise of new growth, new possibilities, new chances for healing in a world that desperately needed both medicine and magic. She was no longer just the witch at the edge of town. She was the bridge between fear and understanding, the woman who had faced death and chosen to keep living, keep healing, keep hoping for a world where difference was celebrated rather than condemned. And sometimes on clear nights when the wind carried whispers from far places, she thought she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats and knew that somewhere James Morrison was still fighting the good fight, just as she was in her own way, in her own place, with her own fierce and tender magic.